preaching on the kingdom for a few weeks now, and the last time I was preaching here, we had a look at John's Gospel and introduced the way that the kingdom is presented in John's Gospel through 7 miraculous signs. And we had a quick look at the wedding at Cana. And there is so much going on in this story. I'll just give you a few details straight up now. There are key phrases that Jesus uses throughout John. My hour has not yet come. Remember, that's what he said to Mary. He says it throughout the book. And then at a certain point, my hour has come. It changes. And we'll see how that changes today. The other one is on the third day, the opening statement, on the third day. Now, when I say on the third day, what does that remind you of? What happened on the third day?
Jesus rose.
The resurrection, didn't it? God displayed his glory on the third day. John is saying God displayed his glory on the third day of this wedding. Right? He's just preparing us. He puts these little signposts all through his book to let us know what's going on. These stone water jars, I've seen them, that sort of thing. They couldn't be made. They could not be made from clay and kiln fired because they'd been touched. Right? They take a solid block of usually limestone over there. It's about that high, these stone jars, and they just carve out the inside, chisel out a nice smooth inside. The outside's left quite rough, just the rough shape, the rough outline. And I have no idea how, they must weigh half a tonne each, right? And there were 6 of them there at this wedding, right? And they were for ritual purification. And for the Jews, this meant that everything had to be dipped into this water in these sacred vessels. Everything had to be, all the cooking utensils used at the wedding had to be rinsed in this sacred water. Everyone had to, apply the water to themselves to be clean, to be a part of the wedding.
Sorry, mate, are they shallow or more than deep?
They're about that high.
Yeah.
And they would go all the way down.
Yeah.
Within about that far. So, as it says, depending upon where, between 20 and 30 gallons. So you're looking at, 50 litres?
Easy.
Easy 50 litres, 60 litres.
Almost.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot of water. But then there were a lot of people for the wedding, weren't there?
Mm.
Now, I'm pretty certain that the Lord knew what he was doing in telling John to include the wedding of Cana as the first and therefore the most significant sign in the whole gospel. I say that because if we don't get a handle on what happened at this wedding, then we don't really grasp what the rest of the gospel is all about, and we puzzle as to why John is so different to the other gospels. So these signs are all occasions when Jesus did, you might say, what he promised that he would do. They're moments when heaven is opened and when the transforming power of God's love bursts into the present world. Right? It's just amazing. It's where heaven touches earth. Wherever Jesus is, that's John's view of the kingdom. Right? That's John's view of the kingdom. Where Jesus is, heaven is reaching down and touching the earth. That's why it simply won't do, despite what some people have said, to see the things that Jesus did and the stories about them in this gospel and the others as pleasant but imaginary stories. Things that didn't actually happen but which illustrate some supposedly deeper, more spiritual truth. The whole point of these signs is that they are moments when heaven and earth intersect with each other, right? Which is what the Jews believed happened in the temple, right? That's where heaven touched earth and the sacrifices were consumed. That's where God's presence was in the Holy of Holies. But Jesus is saying, no, the kingdom is wherever I am, and wherever I am, heaven is reaching down and touching lives and touching hearts. It doesn't have to be in the temple. I am the Lord. The whole point is that they're stories which could not have happened in real life, but which point away from earth to a heavenly reality. And whatever people today may actually think happened, and the more you get to know about Jesus, the more you realise that this sort of thing was precisely what you would expect with him around. And we should be in no doubt that what John Badley wants to tell us is, with all these events, the life of heaven came down to earth. And that's why one of the motto texts for this whole gospel is from verse 14, and the Word became flesh. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Here we go then. Let me tell you a story about a wedding that took place a long time ago in a land far, far away. So the scene is a simple wedding, and a potential social disaster is looming that would have affected the young couple for the rest of their lives. So why did Jesus use this time and this place for his first miraculous act? And John gives us his answer in verse 13 that David read for us a little while ago. It says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. There is no doubt that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. And yet we have the first public act by a man who would be the most significant human being that ever lived. The man whose position in history divides our calendars into the period before his birth and the period after his birth. The man who would use this event, the wedding at Cana, to establish the truths upon which the greatest movement in history was built. And when you look at the wedding at Cana this way, then you realise that there must be a lot more going on than we realise at first glance. It is in fact the gospel in 11 verses. So to look at it from a reader's perspective, why did John use the example of a wedding to open his account of Jesus' ministry? Why did John use the turning of water into wine as Jesus' first sign? Well, the last time I suggested that John was perhaps the interpreter of Jesus, and as they sat together so closely and so intimately, it's easy to imagine Jesus saying, John, this is what's really going on. I want you to write your account for the Greeks. Remember, Jesus is only ministering to Jews, but he wants John to write his gospel for the Greeks. You see, Jesus was vitally interested in saving not just the Jews, but the rest of the world. And the Greeks typified the rest of the world at that time. And we read in John 12 that it was a conversation with certain Greeks that triggers the beginning of the end for Jesus. So here we go. I mentioned this a few moments ago. Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, We would like to see Jesus. And Philip went to tell Andrew, and Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. And Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Did you see it? Did you notice the change in the words that John used? In verse 4 and in several other places in the Gospel, Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come." Now the Greeks want to see Jesus, and that is what Jesus has been waiting for. It is the trigger for the passion that unfolds in the next few days. Jesus is speaking to John. Explain it for the Greeks, John. Tell them what I was doing in ways that they will understand. Tell them that everything that they think they know about religion has to go. Tell them that they must start again, and they must start here. Tell them, John. Tell them that unless they can get hold of who I am, they're lost. I am the only way to salvation, not just for the Jews, but also the Greeks. But no matter what nationality they are, John, they must recognise that my plan of salvation is rooted in the Jewish scriptures. And like it or not, that is the plan. So let's talk about a party, John. Remember the wedding at Cana right back at the beginning? That was where I first displayed a glimpse of my glory. I mean, the Greeks understand wine and parties, so let's use an image they understand to start off the story. So there we were at the wedding, and my mother comes to me and says they're out of wine. My mind was elsewhere, John. I was thinking about another wedding, my own wedding. But before I could become the groom of my old wedding, before I could provide the finest of wines and foods for my wedding feast, I knew I had to die. And I was a bit harsh with my mother, but she understood, and I knew that this was the moment. This was a Jewish wedding, and the religious rules as well as the social rules applied, and that meant that there were several big stone pots of water for ritual purification, not only for the guests, but all the cooking utensils. Everything had to be kosher. This groom had failed to provide enough wine for the wedding. The master of the feast had not correctly judged how much he had to cut the wine with water to ensure that it lasted right through to the end. You know, water's just water, isn't it? No amount of purification or religion was going to save the wedding master or that couple. They were lost. Right? Their lives were as good as over at that point that they ran out of wine. They could not save themselves. Their future was over before it had even begun. And Jesus said, only I could save them. It was time to show them what the heart of God for his people is really all about. Remember, John, I said to the servants, fill up those jars with water, those 6 big stone ones. Right up to the top. All done? Now draw some out of the jar and take it to the master of the feast. John, do you remember the look on their faces when they tasted that wine? It was the best, John. 20-year-old red, matured to perfection and created in a split second of time. It looked like blood, John. And in it I saw my own blood being shed for them to save them. I showed myself as the true Lord of the wedding feast. I showed myself as the true bridegroom who provides not only enough for this feast, but more than enough for the whole world to celebrate eternally with me at the finest and most lavish table that this world has ever seen. I showed them that I am prepared to shed my own life's blood to save them. Do you remember that, John? No one at the feast knew what had happened, did they? None of the guests knew. that I had just given them their first sign as to who I am. But there were a few who did know, wasn't there? Right, who knew John? Well, the servants knew. You and the other disciples and the servants of the feast, they all knew that I was present and working and displaying my glory at that wedding. And those who did exactly as I asked, they saw me reveal my glory. Don't forget to note that little fact in your account, by the way, John. That's important. The ones who chose to obey me, they were the ones who got to see me in my glory. Do you remember the look on all your faces when you realised what had happened? It was at this point that you and the others believed in who I am. I am Yahweh, here in the flesh, John. I am the Lord of the feast. I am the ultimate bridegroom, the Messiah, and the whole world is going to be invited to my wedding. Remember what Isaiah the prophet wrote in chapter 25? He was prophesying on a certain day, and on that day, in Jerusalem, the Lord of heaven's armies will spread a wonderful feast. For all the people of the world, it will be a delicious banquet with clear, well-aged wine and choice meat. John, I am the Lord of the feast. And I have come to bring outrageous festivity, joy, and a lavish, ridiculous, overflowing waterfall of the finest wines and tables overflowing with the finest meat and foods. You know what, John? We've been through some tough stuff together, haven't we? And now it's time to party. I have come to show them what God is really like, John. The Father throws a party like no one here can even imagine. I'm here to show them that they have no idea what God's like or what he is all about. God's love, John. God is the overflowing fullness of joy, and he loves his kids like we cannot begin to imagine. And it's time to bring the kingdom down to earth, John. That's why I told you to pray, your kingdom come. So let's have a little chat about the wine. All right. First off, does anyone here seriously think that it was fresh grape juice? No? Whole bunches of the church believe it was just fresh grape juice. No. It was not fresh grape juice. It was wine. Right? How often during the year can you squeeze fresh grapes? Maybe for 2 weeks? What do you do for the other 50 weeks? Right? They have to ferment the grape juice to preserve it. Have anybody here got Greek or Italian friends? Those that make their grappa every year? They've all got the grapevines over their patios and the garden and stuff. Have you ever tasted freshly fermented wine? New wine tastes disgusting. It's horrendous. At the wedding feast, that was the stuff that they usually serve last. Right? The current year's vintage of red, especially, is what I used to call a rough red back when I was a young man. You have to drink a fair bit of it to numb your taste bud so that it tastes good. So, did Jesus fill those stone jars with new wine? No. He didn't, did he? What wine did he fill those jars with? The good wine, the choice wine, the best wine. You know, the master of the feast. He was a Jewish master of the feast. And you better believe that man knew a good wine when he tasted it. His living depended on it. So it was the best wine. He'd never tasted anything like it. So, what's it worth? What's about 500-600 litres of finest wine worth? Well, whether you go for a Domaine de la Romanée-Conti from Burgundy in France or an Australian 1951 Grange Heritage, they're both worth over $30,000 a bottle. Well over $30,000 a bottle. And in today's money, this was between $20 and $30 million worth of the finest vintage wine that the master of the wedding feast had ever tasted. There was enough left over anyway to set those newlyweds up for life with what was left over from the feast. Eh? What do you think happened to them? I mean, they could not drink that much, could they? So the story has all the elements that we shall come to know well as we work through these accounts. It's about transformation. It's about the different dimension of reality that comes into being when Jesus is present. And when, as Mary tells the servants, people do whatever Jesus tells them. This is one of only 2 occasions that we meet Jesus' mother in this gospel, and the other being at the foot of the cross. And this is important because Jesus' strange remark in verse 4, "My time has not yet come," looks on through many other references to his time until at last his time does come. And his glory is revealed fully as he dies on the cross. The King of the Jews is what they wrote on the top of his head. They crucified their king. That event for John is the ultimate moment when heaven and earth meet. That is what it takes, all the faith in the world to see. The glory hidden in the shame. The creative word present as a weak and dying human being. But events like this one point on to that moment. The wedding is a foretaste of the great heavenly feast in store for God's people. You look at the end of Revelation, you know how it ends. There's a great feast. Right? The water jars used for Jewish purification rites are a sign that God is doing a new thing from within the old Jewish system, bringing purification to Israel and the world in a whole new way. You know, the water is okay for washing, isn't it? But it can't change your life. Water can't give you salvation. The shed blood of Jesus is there for each and every person. And that was what was symbolised in that wine that was transformed at that wedding. Jesus hereafter addresses himself to other kinds of problems, and we're already witnessing the strange compassion which comes where people are in need and deals with that need in unexpected ways. The transformation from water to wine is of course meant by John to signify the effect that Jesus can still have today on people's lives. He came, as he says later, that we might have life in all of its fullness. You might want to pray through this story with your own failures and disappointments in mind, remembering that the transformation only came when someone took Mary's words seriously. Do whatever he tells you. And one final point. What do you think John is hinting at when he says that all this took place on the third day?